Our first story today comes from Dr. Eowyn Lenihan on Twitter, who's done a bit of research digging up a network of anti-fascists on Twitter and linking them to the verified accounts and the companies they work for. I gotta say, I take this all with a grain of salt. The first image you'll see, for those that are watching online, is another kind of crime web. Now, they did the same thing, activists did the same thing to me and others on YouTube, so I always say, it would be hypocritical of me to try and claim that this is somehow more indicative of wrongdoing for them, but not for me. And I also don't know the methodology behind what they're doing. So I do want to go through this. I want to address it. I want to be rational and reasonable. But I can say from my own personal experience, it does seem like Dr. Eowyn Lenihan does have something here. And we can scroll down and see that he's pinpointed some of the most prominent verified journalists. Some people who work for Vice, for Mike.com, or did work for Mike.com, and for The Guardian. And I believe that some of his conclusions are correct. It appears that we actually have more examples of journalists working, I should say journalists with air quotes, working for major news publications who are anti-fascist activists, and in some instances have been accused of actually paying Antifa to dox people so they can then publish the news on their platform. My understanding, and I do know some of these people personally, and that's why I believe it, but we'll go through it. I'll take it with a grain of salt, and I'll give some pushback. But what they do is, they're essentially activists themselves, and they hide behind the label of journalist to make it seem like their activism is some kind of legitimate news service. So I want to do one important thing. I want to show what we're working on before we get into reading through this thread. I worked for these big companies. I worked for Vice, I worked for Fusion, and I have seen firsthand the far left ideology, identitarianism, anti-fascist extremism. I hate how they call it anti-fascist because they're not, everybody is anti-fascist except for fascists. So, I am anti-fascist, right? But the brand of Antifa is it's particularly dangerous, violent, extremist, and these people who typically, wear all black and call themselves Antifa are not regular Americans who believe in freedom. They are the fringe extremists who tend to be authoritarians. They use violence to impose their will on others. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show Subverse, because one of the things we're going to be doing, and we are doing, is making content without an agenda. The best way I can describe it, our only agenda is knowledge. And that's an important thing that I think was lost with all these media companies and why we're seeing a story about, journalists who are actually anti-fascist activists. We're not going to tolerate that as we expand Subverse. I also want to do another thing. If you want to support my work, I normally don't mention this on this channel, but we're going to be setting up memberships as we expand Subverse. For the time being, you can support me by going to timcast.com/donate if you like what I do. As this is going to be my primary, news show and channel, I'm going to be, mentioning my, how you can support me more often. But let's not waste any more time. Let's go through this thread. I'll also add really quickly, easiest way you can support these videos is just to share them or click the like button if you like the video. Eowyn Lenihan tweets, going to do a long thread on the relationship between verified Twitter accounts, focus on journalists, and Antifa warning could be long. He says, we mapped the social interactions of 58,254 Antifa-affiliated accounts on Twitter based on an initial seed of 16 self-identifying and verifiable Antifa accounts, and Mark Bray, who chose not to confirm if he is a member of Antifa, but whose book makes a solid case for inclusion. Mark Bray wrote the Anti-Fascist Handbook, so most people are going to assume that's the case. Now, I do want to point out here something really important when it comes to the Antifa activists. We can see Rose City Antifa right in the middle. I often refer to the fact that Antifa isn't just random accounts. People wonder why the Proud Boys were all banned and Antifa wasn't, and the left often says, well, it's because Antifa is, disparate and decentralized. Not true. Here we can see that while cells typically operate independently, they do interact with each other to extreme degrees. They share information, so they don't have a direct hierarchy. But we can see that Rose City Antifa, for instance, is a branded cell. They have their own merchandise, okay? Just because they don't have a leader of all of Antifa doesn't mean there's not organized groups that have brands, specific brands. Rose City Antifa is a brand, Okay, they're making reference to Portland, obviously. You can see Philly Antifa NYC, but these are specifically branded groups. They can be individually removed for breaking the rules. They aren't. Lenahan says, we reduced the data set to 1.65 of all 58,254 accounts, leaving us with 962 accounts. These were the 1.65 most connected Antifa and Antifa-associated accounts on Twitter. Each had a minimum of 8 connections with the initial data set, most having many more. He says, here I just want to focus on those Twitter-verified accounts that made it into this data set of the most connected Antifa and Antifa-associated accounts on Twitter. Here you can see them highlighted in green. So we can then see that he highlights, some specific individuals. I'm going to use their names simply because they're in this, and I want to make sure I say this before I read individual names. I was smeared on a list of a crime web as well. Take it with a grain of salt. The alternative influence network thing that went around was absurdly, incorrect. And I want to stress, not to the disrespect of Dr. Lenahan here, but just to point out, it seems like he's basing these off social interactions. While highly unlikely, it is possible some of these people might have negative social interactions. I doubt it, right? I'm just saying, take it with a grain of salt. If I would ask you not to trust the alternative influence network, then I would present the same kind of skepticism towards this. So there is some things I want to go through though that represent what makes the AIN thing different from this, right? So they claimed that I appeared in videos, and that was it. It was like, Tim appeared in a video with Andy Worski. That's deceptive, extremely misleading. The video in question was someone at VidCon was filming. I talked to them and walked away, and then later Andy Worski came up and talked to them, and they claimed that was me collaborating with Worski. Absolutely absurd. And they had a line connecting Chris Ray Gun to Richard Spencer. Never happened. That's absurd. So that I can, definitely debunk. In terms of this, these are just based off of social media interactions, so it is different. But again, I want to stress, because now we're going to look at some of these individuals. We have Jack Smith, formerly of Vice. We have Tess Owen, I believe, of Vice News. We have Jason A.W., who is of The Guardian. Emily Gorsinski. I'm not sure who some of these people are, but we can also see that we have a ton of smaller accounts, and all definitely Antifa linked and interacting with these journalists, which is really, really fascinating. So it says, at 8 connections and above within the data set, the typical verified account is an openly self-identifying anti-fascist and an influential member of the Antifa movement on Twitter. For example, Kit O'Connell, who points out his anti-fascist affiliation in his bio. Now, this is actually kind of a sad story because I know Kit personally, and he invited me out in early 2012, I believe, to give a presentation on live streaming technique to some local citizen journalist types. Kit initially was an Occupy activist guy, and he was rational and normal. And, he has his politics. In 2011, I was filming Black Bloc anarchists. I was getting attacked for it. The far left types hated me. They hated me the whole time. I refused to make propaganda. Kit saw through that and invited me out to Austin. Strangely now, he's become an extremist, would be saying lightly. He's gone above and beyond extremist. He sent me crazy ass messages about, I'm not going to get into exactly what he said, but somewhat threatening messages, somewhat threatening. Just he's absolutely been radicalized to an insane and extreme degree where he's I believe, this is my personal opinion, but I do believe that he may be, how do I say this? Not seeing reality, losing the capability to understand the world around him. I don't want to imply any kind of medical diagnosis, but you see what I'm trying to say. And I mean that sincerely. I met this guy, we've talked online, and I even tried explaining to him, how you de-radicalize, and he's just gone off the rails. And I when I say gone off the rails, I mean this dude, wow, really, really just living in another dimension. I seriously think he might need some medication. I mean that sincerely. Next, we have Patrick Strickland, who specializes in reporting on the far right and writes positively on Antifa in Europe. Note the recommendation from Mark Bray. This individual, Dylan Petrohilos, just another activist. We have Dan Arell, who my understanding is that, I could be wrong, but I believe there was some kind of messages from Dan, he was talking to friends, and he's actually more of just a troll. And I mean that literally. I'm not trying to disparage him. Troll gets thrown around a lot. No, my understanding is that he actually just tries to trigger people. That he's not really a far left in that sense. He just likes jumping on the bandwagon and getting people angry. There were some messages I saw from like him and another person that were leaked or something. I could be wrong about this because it's been a long time. But that's what I thought happened. Again, I could be wrong. I want to stress this. But it was something about him saying like, yeah, I know it's not true, but like I just like getting a rise out of people. They bring up Emily Gorsensky. He says, Gorsensky uses Twitter to dox those she deems fascist. Further, she created the first Vigil website that processes court documents to share the personal information of suspected members of the far right. In cases where people are found innocent, 50% info is still shared. Now, let's move on to the more interesting stuff because I don't want to make a ridiculously long video on this matter. But he does mention that there are people who work for Huffington Post and The Guardian, notably Jason Wilson. He says Wilson writes for The Guardian in a recent piece in which he reports on an intelligence report by the ROCIC, which states that Antifa are responsible for street violence, just as the far right are. He heavily relies on Mark Bray as a primary source to attack the report. My main issue with Jason Wilson and others is that they're very obviously activists, right? So when you look at his stuff, he once tried claiming that I was like in some way alt-right because one time I interviewed these guys. Completely bad faith, activist take, and masquerading opinion as fact, using heavily biased sources, not ethical at all. This guy is very obviously an activist. Mark Bray wrote the Anti-Fascist Handbook. It's very obvious that he's taking, he's asking Antifa and giving them a puff piece because yes, he is. We can move on to, this is really interesting because this is Christopher Mathias. I believe I've met him on more than one occasion. Lenahan says, Mathias is a senior writer at Huffington Post who specializes in the far right. In recent pieces he wrote about members of Identity Europa, he spread the doxes of several alleged members serving in the military. At the time of writing, he had no idea of their innocence or guilt. As of his pinned tweet, the matter is still only under investigation. How he came to dox these individuals before they were afforded any due process is interesting. He goes on to say, anti-fascist news outlet UR Ninja leaked Discord servers from an Identity Europa server in April, and Mathias took them from there. It's a common theme. Mathias lets Antifa doxers do the heavy work. He does the national level doxing. Nate Thayer, another fave of his. Here he uses HuffPo to out a prominent, far right guy, and was instrumental, along with his Antifa network, in getting him investigated. It later turned out the man was cleared of any wrongdoing and allowed back to work. Now, I don't believe this is true, which is why I always say take this stuff with a grain of salt, because here's the chain of events we have from Huffington Post. The first story, the state is investigating this guy. His name is Alex McNabb. The second story, cleared by investigation. The third story, he has been fired from his job. So I don't believe that Lenahan is correct. I haven't found any updates. I don't think he has gotten his job back. I think Lenahan may be wrong on this. He was ultimately let go. He says Mathias harvests info from his Antifa network to cast serious allegations against individuals with potentially career-shattering consequences, and through doxing opens up the real chance of violence and harm against them. He then goes on to reference Michael Edison Hayden. Now, Michael Edison Hayden is somebody who I've mentioned on several occasions because he's repeatedly called for censorship, and himself and other left-wing activists have been censored. But let's move on to the more egregious accusation. Mathias is not alone in mining Antifa for doxes. He says that Luke O'Brien at Huffington Post seems to create a constant Nazi scare to fill headlines. Lenahan says, I spoke to two defectors from a doxing collective who said a HuffPo writer offered cash. He goes on to say that they fed false information to personally harm people they didn't like. Here, the doxer who claimed he has a HuffPost journalist on call admits the individual they are doxing is not far right or fascist, but they'll give the info just because they have been incentivized. He says a HuffPost writer incentivized Antifa doxers to provide him with the doxes of the far right. The doxer admits here in the DMs provided by a member of the group, clearly states they had no such people, but they had a grudge against them, so that will suffice. Notice how eager the doxer states that we got a major publication on him after clearly stating the person they doxed is not far right. I can't confirm which HuffPo writer incentivized the hunting, but there's at least one whose bylines are extended in all the doxes. Excuse me. So I'll say a few things. We don't know if these screenshots are true. Of course, people are going to try and smear the other side. They tried doing the same thing to me. I bring this up mostly because there's been a decent amount of traction on people sharing this thread. And I don't know how much the initial tweet has. Actually, I should refresh. It's got 108 retweets. And it does fall to 440 retweets as of this morning, as of the recording of this video. It's from a couple days ago. And I want to make a few points. I want to stress something. take all of this with a grain of salt because, again, the Alternative Influence Network, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to Ewan Lenahan because I don't know him personally. I know he follows me. But just because people interact online doesn't mean their interests are aligned. I will say, however, some of the people implicated in this I know for a fact to be activists. And one of the things that I'm going to say as I sign off on this video, one of the projects that we're going to be rolling out with Subverse as we expand, we're hiring. We've gotten over 1,000 applicants. It's amazing. We're setting up a space. We're looking for investors. But here's the important part. I'm a moderate fan of NewsGuard. You may be familiar with the NewsGuard service. They give a rating, a nutrition rating, to various news websites. However, I believe their methodology to be imperfect. If you're not familiar, what NewsGuard does is they judge things based off a few criteria. So let's do this. We'll pull up Huffington Post, who has a near perfect NewsGuard rating. But we can see here, I don't know if you can see this because sometimes it doesn't appear, handles the difference between news and opinion responsibly, and they give Huffington Post an X. And they're right. Huffington Post routinely writes opinion as fact. But here's the thing. They should also have an X for gathers and presents information responsibly. I disagree. Regularly corrects and clarifies errors I can't speak to. Does not repeatedly publish false content. I think they're leaning toward leniency on this one. That's fine. Avoids deceptive headlines. Look, if you're going to fall in, if you're going to give an X on opinion and news, there's going to be more X's. I'd have to say it's a cascade effect. But this is what they do, right? So this is how their nutrition label works. Our plan for Subverse is, so far now, and I tweeted about this, is to do a random sampling of 100 articles and then present an X out of 100 in terms of deception. So this is the plan so far, and if you're interested and you feel like being a fact checker, I guess is the best way to put it, the goal would be, probably, we have to figure out an appropriate period because we want to make sure people have the ability to correct their mistakes. But we would start from the day of research and go back something like 3 months, take a random sampling, of 100 articles, read through them, fact check them, see if they're labeled correctly. Any fault will be deemed an X, a negative, okay? So basically, if they write a news story and there is an opinion in it and it is not labeled, we will give them a negative on that story. We're going to create a spreadsheet for every news outlet explaining why we gave this story a negative, and then we'll put together basically out of the 100 stories we sampled, X out of 100 were factual news. And then if you click it, you'll have the spreadsheet and you can go and check for yourself. And if you disagree with us, you can come to us. But it's going to be very methodical. We're not going, I don't care about your politics. I just care about if you write a news story that says X happened to Y or X is occurring in Y place. And in that story, you say something like, in reference to the BuzzFeed story recently, the executives have only themselves to blame, X right off the bat. That has nothing to do with the story. If you say, like they did in the BuzzFeed story, there is a moral crisis at YouTube, X, that is an opinion. You have to label these things as opinion or editorial. If you are not doing that, you are not presenting news. So we will strive to make sure we're only pulling up the news stories. And in the instance of Huffington Post, we can clearly see NewsGuard agrees. They do not handle the difference between news and opinion responsibly, nor do most of these sites. And while NewsGuard is fine, I think they make the mistake of not quantifying, because I can easily pull up stories that I know to be false. So what you'll end up seeing, Huffington Post would probably get like a 71 out of 100 or something. Probably less. I think Huffington Post would actually do fairly poorly on this. And of course, Breitbart and InfoWars would probably get a poor score as well. As much as many people on the right probably want to believe, they're telling the truth more often, it's not so much whether or not they have their facts straight. It's about responsibly providing information to the public, and if they don't label things opinion and otherwise. That's what we're going to be doing. And we're going to do the same thing for ourselves on the website. We will absolutely make sure everything is labeled with a correction policy, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to ramble too long. I've already gone for 20 minutes. So I will just, end by saying this. I always want to make sure that unless we have something definitive, all I can really say is this is an interesting bit of information. Take it with a grain of salt. I lean towards believing that it's, true for the most part. But I recognize that I've been smeared as well and don't like the idea of targeting, journalists and linking them this way, because it's basically the same thing. I'll leave it there. For those that are listening on the podcast, next story coming up in a couple seconds, and I will see the rest of you at 1 p.m. on the YouTube channel.